The orchard foreman counted her pennies into his palm, one by one, like he was counting out alms to a beggar woman who didn't know better. Behind him, a wagon groaned under a mountain of bruised apples, hail-battered, split-skinned, going soft in the afternoon sun. He grinned. Wide and easy. The grin of a man who believes he's just fleeced a fool. She thanked him kindly, took the reins, didn't look back once as the wheels turned toward home. He was still laughing when she rounded the bend. He would not be laughing in October. Before the wagon, before the pennies, before the foreman ever thought to call her a fool, there was a press. It stood in the barn where her father left it, oak beams gone silver with age, the great screw rusted at the collar, cobwebs strung between the slats like the whole machine had been sleeping and did not intend to wake. She was 11 when he first let her turn the handle. 26 now, and the barn smelled the same as it had then. Old wood, old fruit, old rain. He had been dead 3 winters. The bank had taken the north pasture, then the good mare, then, this past spring, very nearly the roof over her head. What the bank could not take was the press. It was too old to be worth seizing, too old, everyone said, to be worth much of anything. That was the valley's verdict on Clara Doss entire, if she was honest with herself at the work table, which she tried to be more often than not. Widowed young, no, not even widowed, worse than that, though she did not care to dwell on the worse than that most days. Left with a debt she hadn't made, and a farmhouse she couldn't quite keep, and a press nobody wanted, because pressing cider was slow, unfashionable work when a man could sell his apples whole for coin he could spend that same afternoon at the saloon. She heard the talk at the mercantile. She heard it plainer than the talkers thought she could. Poor Clara Doss, still playing farmer. She had $2 left the morning she walked to Halloran's orchard. $2, folded twice in her apron pocket, and a wagon she'd borrowed off Ansel Pruitt for the promise of a barrel come fall. If there was a fall worth speaking of, which Ansel's face told her he doubted. Halloran's orchard had taken a hailstorm 3 days prior, the kind that comes down in July like the sky's lost patience, and half his crop lay bruised and split on the ground, or hanging soft and ruined on the branch. Wormwood worthless, Halloran's foreman called it. Penn Tolliver was his name, a heavy-set man with a laugh that came too easy, and a way of looking at a woman like her opinion was a mild inconvenience he was too polite to mention outright. "You want the bruised lot?" Penn said, when she told him what she'd come for. "All of it?" "All of it," she said. "The wagon full." He laughed then, first time, not the last, and named a price so low it embarrassed him to say it, though not enough to stop him saying it. $2 for 32 bushels of hail-bruised apples. $2 for what the orchard would otherwise have fed to the hogs, or let rot where it fell. "You know these won't keep," Penn said, not unkindly, just the way you'd tell a child the stove is hot. "Can't sell bruised fruit at market. Folks want a clean apple." "I don't want to sell apples," Clara said. He didn't ask what she did want. He counted her $2 into his palm instead, slow, like he was savoring the moment, like he'd tell this story at the saloon that night. The Doss widow, buying garbage with her last coin. She let him have his moment. $2 was $2, whether he grinned over it or not, and grinning men rarely watch closely what a quiet woman does next. Not garbage, not to her. Bruised apples bleed their sugar fast. Split skin lets in the air, lets the sugars start turning before the fruit even leaves the tree. A clean apple, unbruised, holds tight and slow and stubborn. Good for the cellar, good for market, good for a winter of eating one a day out of a barrel. But a bruised apple, softening fast, sugars already loosening in the flesh, that apple wants to become something else. That apple is halfway to cider before it ever sees a press. Her father had told her that a summer she turned 11, standing at the very same press, his hands over hers on the screw. Bruised fruit isn't ruined fruit, Clara girl. It's fruit in a hurry. And there is a use for everything in a hurry, if you know what it's hurrying toward. She had not thought of that sentence in years. It came back to her whole, word for word, as she drove the wagon home past the fence line where two boys sat on the top rail and watched her pass with a load of soft, mottled apples, and did not bother to hide their laughing. The insight was simple, and she turned it over on the ride home like a coin she meant to spend carefully. Bruised apples, worthless for the barrel, worthless for market, worthless by every measure the valley used to price a bushel, were, in fact, the very best apples a body could ask for, if cider was the aim. The sugars were already loosening, the skins already broken, softening the pulp for the crush. What Halloran's foreman had sold her as trash was, pound for pound, a head start, not waste. Inventory nobody priced right. She said that to herself twice on the ride home, quiet, under her breath, the way you test a phrase to see if it holds your weight. It held. The first labor was the sorting, and it took her the better part of 2 days, hunched over crates in the barn's cool shadow, with a knife for the worst rot, and her bare hands for the rest, culling out anything gone past bruised and into black. Anything with the sour smell that meant the whole barrel could turn. Her father's rule, spoken so many summers ago she'd near forgotten she knew it until her hands remembered for her. One bad apple doesn't ruin the batch if you catch it before it spreads its rot to its neighbors. Catch it, cut it clean, move on. By the second evening her hands were stained brown to the wrist, sugar sticky, nicked twice by the paring knife, and she had 30 bushels sorted true. 2 lost to rot she couldn't save, which she counted as a fair toll for fruit bought at $2 the wagon load. Then the washing, then the crushing. The scratter was older than she was, a hand-cranked wooden drum lined with iron teeth that her father had built himself one winter when he couldn't afford to buy one from the mill catalog. She fed the apples in a few at a time, turned the crank, and watched the fruit come apart into pomace, pulp and skin and seed, pale gold, wet, fragrant. The whole barn filling up with a smell like the inside of an orchard in September, sweet and sharp at once. Her arm ached before the first bushel was through. She had 29 more to go. She thought, more than once that first week, of simply quitting, selling the pomace as hog feed and calling the $2 a loss she could afford, which it was, barely. But quitting had a taste to it she'd come to hate worse than a sore arm, and so she turned the crank another hour and another, until the light went and she worked by lamp and did not stop until every bushel had gone through the teeth. The pressing came next, and this was the part her father had loved best, she remembered. The part where the pomace went into cloth-lined racks, layer on layer, cheese style, he'd called it. A word she hadn't understood as a girl, and understood now down to her bones. Because building the pressed cheese was exactly like building anything worth its name. Layer by layer, patient, nothing rushed, or the whole stack would slump and spill and waste the labor that built it. She packed the pomace into squares of clean muslin, folded the cloth over like a parcel, set a wooden rack atop it, packed another layer, another rack, until the press bed held 6 layers stacked like a lopsided cake, near 3 feet high, the whole barn gone thick with the smell of crushed apple and cold iron. Then, the screw. She'd forgotten how much strength the old press wanted. She leaned her whole weight into the handle, and it groaned like something waking from a long sleep it resented losing. And for a moment, nothing happened at all. And she thought, wild and sudden, that the machine itself had given up, same as the valley had given up on her. Then the first thread of juice ran down the trough, pale gold, near clear, catching the lamplight like something poured from a jewelry box, rather than squeezed from garbage a foreman had been glad to be rid of. She stood there a long moment, just watching it run. Not charity, not luck. Work. The juice filled her father's old oak barrels, 4 of them, scrubbed clean, sulfur smoked to kill the wild rot before she'd trust them with a drop. And she racked them in the cellar where the temperature held steady and cool. And she waited. Because cider, unlike most everything else in her life just then, could not be hurried by wanting it hurried. That was the hardest part. Not the arm-aching press, not the sorting, not even Penn Tolliver's laugh still ringing somewhere at the back of her thinking. The hardest part was the waiting. 4 barrels breathing slow through their bungs in a dark cellar, turning by degrees she couldn't see and couldn't rush, while up above her, the valley went on believing what it had always believed about the Doss widow and her worthless, bruised apples. Ansel Pruitt came by on the 3rd week, ostensibly to check on his borrowed wagon, though she suspected the wagon was an excuse and the curiosity was the real errand. He was an old hand, had worked orchards 40 years before his knees gave out and put him to smaller work, and he stood in her cellar doorway with his hat in his hand, looking at the 4 barrels with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Bruised fruit cider," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." He was quiet a moment. Then he crouched, put his ear near the bunghole of the nearest barrel, the way she'd seen her father do 100 times, listening for the fermentation's soft, working hiss. "Huh," he said. That was all. But he came back the following week uninvited, and the week after that. And by the 4th visit, he'd taken to bringing his own barrel hoops in his coat pocket, quietly repairing the 2 that had gone loose on the 2nd cask without being asked, without being paid, without saying much of anything about why an old orchard hand would spend his afternoons in a widow's cellar over cider everyone in 3 counties had already decided was a fool's errand. He believed first, before there was anything to believe in yet but a smell and a sound. That mattered more than she let herself say out loud. Word does travel in a valley, even word about a fool's errand, maybe especially that. By August, Penn Tolliver had heard, the way she'd known he would, and he made a special trip out to her place under the pretense of asking after the wagon he'd never once mentioned wanting returned. "Making cider from my bruised apples," he said. And there was that grin again, easy as ever, though something in it had gone a shade uncertain, like a man testing ice he isn't sure will hold. "Out of pity, apples." "They weren't pity," Clara said. "They were $2. You set the price." He laughed at that, but it came out thinner than his laugh in July, and he left without asking to taste anything, which told her he hadn't come to check on cider at all. He'd come to check on her, to see if the joke still held its shape 3 weeks on, and it hadn't, quite. And that troubled him more than he let show. The trouble proper started in September, when Otis Mabry came calling. Otis owned the Mercantile, and, more to the point, owned most of what passed for opinion at the mercantile counter, where half the valley's business got decided over the sound of scales weighing flour. He was smooth where Penn was easy, careful where Penn was careless, and he had wanted Clara's north pasture back when the bank first came sniffing. Wanted it bad enough that folks still whispered he'd had a hand in how fast the bank moved. He did not laugh when he stood in her yard that September afternoon. He smiled instead, which was worse. "Heard you're pressing cider," he said. "For selling, I understand. At Market." "That's the plan." "There's no cider stall at Market. Never has been." I'd not know where the county board would even list such a thing. He said it mild as milk, like he was doing her a kindness by pointing out an obstacle rather than building one. Might be simplest, you sold your juice to me in bulk. I have a standing account with a bottler out of the county seat. Save you the trouble of a stall nobody's built for. What would you offer? He named a price. It was fair for raw juice, she'd grant him that. Fair, and also a fraction, a small fraction, of what 4 barrels of finished, settled cider might fetch a body willing to sell it, cup by cup, jar by jar, direct to a thirsty crowd on a market Saturday. He knew that. She knew he knew it. That was the whole shape of the offer. Not a kindness, a closing door dressed up as one. "I'll press on," she said. Otis's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, the way still water shows a current only once something's dropped in it. "There's no stall," he said again, gentler this time, which made it colder. "I sit on the board that lists them. Might be a long wait getting one approved." He left without raising his voice once. He didn't need to. The lean weeks came after that, September running toward October, and they came the way lean weeks always do, not as one crisis, but as 100 small discouragements stacking like unpaid bills. No stall, a whisper, traced back eventually to the mercantile counter, that Doss cider had gone sour in the cask, a lie with no truth in it that she still had to fight down every time she heard it repeated. A hard frost early, threatening the last of the pressing before she'd meant to do it. Ansel's knees acting up bad enough he missed a week of visits, and she found herself alone in the cellar at 3 in the morning more than once, ear to a bunghole, same as he'd taught her, listening for a hiss that told her the barrels were still alive and working, still hers, still worth the $2 and the arm ache and the waiting. She did not cry in that cellar. She wanted to, once, badly, on the night she totaled her ledger by lamplight and found the numbers smaller than the hope she'd built on top of it. But she had learned, somewhere in 3 winters of widowhood, that crying didn't turn a screw or seal a barrel, and so she blew out the lamp instead and went to bed, and got up the next morning and fed the hogs and checked the frost line, and went on. It was a boy, in the end, who broke the market open for her, the miller's son, 9 years old, who'd wandered by the cellar door one afternoon on some errand for his father, and asked, with the bluntness only children manage, if he could taste it. She should have said no, should have waited for the settling to finish proper. She poured him half a cup anyway, some impulse she couldn't later explain, and watched his face do something she hadn't seen a face do in a long, long while. His eyes went wide, and he said, around a mouthful, "That's better than my pa's." His pa's cider was well regarded in the valley. Had been for years. The boy told everyone, boys do. By the second week of October, there wasn't a soul under 14 in 3 miles who hadn't heard that the Doss widow's cellar held something worth sneaking a taste of, and where the children led, the parents, sooner or later, followed to see what the fuss concerned. Otis Mabry's stall problem solved itself the way these things sometimes do, when enough ordinary people start asking the same question at once, and the man holding the answer finds it costs him more to keep saying no than to finally say yes. The county board, 3 men, none of them Otis, though he sat close enough to make his displeasure known, approved a temporary cider stall for the harvest fair, first Saturday of November, at the edge of the market square nearest the church steps. She had 4 full barrels ready. She had jars borrowed from 3 neighbors, and a wooden sign Ansel had carved for her without being asked, the letters plain and deep cut. Doss Cider, pressed from the orchard's own. The morning of the fair came in cold and clear, frost silvering the grass, breath showing in the air, the whole square smelling of wood smoke and roasting chestnuts and, faint under it, apple. She set up before dawn, Ansel helping despite his knees, and she stood behind her stall as the square filled, hands wrapped around a warming jar of her own cider, waiting. Pen Tolliver was among the first to wander by, hands in his coat pockets, that old grin trying to find its footing and not quite managing it. "Still playing farmer," he said, the same line, worn thin now, more habit than mockery. She poured him a cup without a word. He drank. His face did the same thing the miller's boy's face had done, though on a grown man used to hiding what he felt, it showed itself smaller. A widening of the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, a long breath out through the nose. He looked down at the cup like it had said something to him personally. "This is my orchard," he said, quiet. "It's my press," Clara said, "and my patience. You sold me the fruit for $2, Mr. Tolliver. You didn't sell me what I'd make of it." He bought 2 jars that morning, came back at noon and bought 4 more, for his wife, he said, though she suspected some of it was for himself, to keep tasting whatever it was he'd been so quick to laugh away in July. Word moved through the square the way fire moves through dry grass. One cup passed to a neighbor, one neighbor telling the next, until the line at the Doss cider sign stretched past the chestnut cart, and folks were asking, by name now, for the widow's cider, not cider generally, hers specifically, the bruised apple cider, the one the miller's boy wouldn't stop talking about. By early afternoon, she'd sold through the first barrel entire. By the time the church bell rang 3, the second was near gone, and Ansel stood beside her, grinning wide enough to show the gap in his teeth, saying nothing, just grinning, which, from Ansel, was practically a parade. Otis Mabry came by near the end of the day, when the crowd had thinned and only the barrel dregs were left to sell. He didn't buy a cup. He stood a moment at the edge of her stall, looking at the empty barrels stacked behind her, looking at the sign Ansel had carved, looking at her. "You'll want a permanent stall come spring," he said at last. Not quite an apology, not quite anything but arithmetic, spoken by a man who understood numbers better than most, and had just watched hers beat his. "I could put it before the board." "I'd appreciate that," Clara said, and left it there, because there was no cause to gloat over a man simply doing, late, what should have been easy from the start. He nodded once and walked off into the thinning crowd, and that, she understood, was as close to changed eyes as Otis Mabry would ever show a soul. By the following spring, the north pasture was bought back, not given, not forgiven, bought, dollar for dollar, out of a cider ledger that had gone from $2 of bruised fruit to a sum that still made her sit down slow when she totaled it by lamplight. Pen Tolliver's orchard sold her every bruised bushel from every hailstorm that came after, at a fair price now, agreed beforehand, no counting pennies into a grinning palm. Ansel took a standing chair by her cellar door most autumn afternoons, calling it checking his hoops, and she let him call it that, because some truths are kinder left in their comfortable clothes. The miller's boy got a jar of his own every pressing season from then on, first pour, his by right as far as she was concerned. And the valley's talk changed the way valley talk does, quietly, without anyone quite admitting they'd ever said otherwise. Not poor Clara Doss anymore, not still playing farmer, but simply Doss cider, said the way you'd say any good thing that had simply always been there, worth what it was worth, needing no further argument. If there's a lesson in a wagon load of bruised apples, it's maybe only this. The world will price you the way it prices a split-skinned apple, quick and careless and sure of itself. And it will very often be wrong. Worth isn't a number some foreman counts into his palm while he grins. Worth is what you make of the thing nobody else wanted, given time, given patience, given the plain, stubborn work of turning a screw until the juice runs clear. The greatest things are usually close at hand, waiting only to be truly seen. A press left in a barn, a bushel called garbage, a woman folks had already decided wasn't worth a second look. Scorn is loud, and it costs the speaker nothing. But harvest speaks only once, and it feeds you the whole winter through. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, I hope you'll tell me in the comments, your town, your country, however far this story traveled to reach you. And if some part of you is holding on to something the world has called worthless, I hope you'll hold on a little longer. Some of the finest things start out looking exactly like nothing at all. Rest well tonight, and may your own harvest, whatever it is, come in full.